graphing review, we have multiple graphs on the leftmost part of the page, and as we go down each graph, we'll address each row one at a time. The first graph is position versus time, so the meaning of the data points is position at a given time point. Units of the slope will come based on rise over run, or change in the vertical axis position divided by the change in the horizontal axis position, which would be meters per second. The meaning of the slope for the first one is velocity. The second graph is velocity versus time. With a velocity graph, we have velocity at a given time point as the meaning of the data points. The units of the slope, we know that the slope would give us acceleration, so that should be meters per second square. We can also think of it as velocity is meters per second, time is in seconds. When we divide those, we get meters per second square. Meaning of the slope, just mentioned that a second ago, that is acceleration. Units of the area under the curve. Area under the curve is when we're multiplying the axes. So meters per second times seconds would give us just meters. And the meaning of the area under the curve is displacement for a velocity graph. The next graph down is acceleration versus time, so the meaning of the data points is acceleration at a given time point. The units of the area under the curve, when we multiply meters per second squared times seconds, we are left with meters per second, and that is a unit of velocity. So in an acceleration versus time graph, when you look at the area under the curve, you're looking at velocity. The fourth graph is force versus position. So the meaning of the data points is force at a given position. The units of the slope, rise over run, change in the vertical axis divided by change in the horizontal axis, would be newtons over meters. Force is in newtons, position is in meters. We're going to skip over the next box, and we're going to go on to the units of the area under the curve. This would be Newton meters or joules, which would give us work, because force times displacement is work. We're almost there. The next to last graph is a force versus mass graph. Makes me think of Newton's second law, where we know force divided by mass is acceleration. But let's go through the blanks. We've got meaning of the data points, force for a given mass. Units of the slope would be newtons divided by kilograms, or meters per second square, because we know force divided by mass is acceleration, so it should have that same unit available. Meaning of the slope, again, acceleration, Newton's second law. Final graph, force versus time. The meaning of the data points is force at a given time point. Units of the area under the curve, again, we're multiplying by the axes, so we would have force in newtons times time in seconds, and force times time. The meaning of the area under the curve, force times time, would be impulse.